Hey guys, tonight we begin with the surprisingly grim world of royal hygiene. Specifically, the worst hygiene practices of royal women, the queens, duchesses and ladies who wore silk, ruled courts, and often smelled like old cheese. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You'd think queens, draped in silks and sipping from jewel-encrusted goblets, would have a standing date with a marble bathtub and a lavender-scented loofah. But no. In the grand tradition of historical irony, royal women were some of the least bathed people in Europe, and it wasn't due to a lack of plumbing. It was on purpose. You see, back then, bathing wasn't just unnecessary, it was downright dangerous. According to the finest court physicians, the same brilliant minds who believed hysteria was caused by a wandering womb, hot water opened your pores and invited disease in like a nosy neighbour. Pores were basically tiny drawbridges, and bathing lowered them all at once. Plague? In. Demons? Also in. So what was the solution? Easy. Don't bathe. Ever. Queen Isabella of Castile famously declared she only bathed twice in her life, once when she was born and once when she got married. After that, her body was a closed system, a nation-conquering, soap-deflecting ecosystem of legend. When queens did brave a bath, it required logistics that would humble a siege army. First, fire up about 40 buckets. Then, hope the servants don't scald your royal backside or leave you soaking in lukewarm sadness. Most tubs were leaky wooden barrels, less spa day, more bobbing for parasites. So instead, royal women adopted the wipe and hope method. Linen cloths rubbed against unwashed skin to remove surface sins. No water, no soap, no dignity. Just friction and denial. And to cover the scent of layered human fermentation, perfume. So much perfume. Think, gallons of floral oil, powdered ambergris, and anything vaguely plant-like. It wasn't so much pleasant as it was aggressively fragrant. A courtier once wrote that approaching Queen Catherine de' Medici was like being punched by roses. Some gowns had herbs sewn into them, like walking casseroles of time and despair. Others reeked of violet water and defeat. But to the nose of the 14th century, that was glamour. In a perfect world, royalty would have used water and soap to clean themselves. But as we established, that required acknowledging both the existence of pores and the possibility that their bodies produced smells like everyone else's. And that simply wouldn't do. So instead they turned to perfume. Glorious, choking, sinus-punching perfume. Royal women didn't just wear perfume, they weaponized it. The goal wasn't to smell good, it was to smell stronger than whatever was crawling around underneath. And in that sense they succeeded. They weren't dabbing it behind the ears. Oh no. They were bathing in it, spraying it into wigs, rubbing it into gloves, and in some cases infusing their furniture with it. If you sat on a duchess's chair, you'd walk away smelling like wilted violets and mild ammonia. A true courtly souvenir. Perfume was also political. A well-scented royal woman projected wealth, grace, and above all, distance. If you could mask a 4-day sweat with a top note of jasmine and a base of ambergris, you clearly had power, and possibly whale vomit, because that's what ambergris is, a waxy substance produced in a sperm whale's digestive system. Royals rubbed it on their necks like Chanel No. 5. Queen Marie Antoinette had an entire personal perfumer, tasked with developing custom fragrances for every mood and event. Morning perfume, afternoon perfume, I'm being beheaded perfume. All distinct, all floral, all attempting to gaslight everyone around her into thinking she didn't smell like 12 layers of velvet and panic. Royal ladies also carried scented handkerchiefs, pressed discreetly to their faces whenever someone poorer, or more realistic, entered the room. Some even wore little pomanders. decorative orbs filled with crushed herbs and spices, which they held under their noses like medieval air fresheners. In the end, the perfume didn't make them clean. It just made them noticeably unclean with style. They were essentially walking potpourri baskets with political power. Royal women wore some of the most extravagant clothing in history. Velvet, silk, brocade, fur. Layered skirts that could double as makeshift tents. Embroidered bodices tight enough to cause spiritual awakenings. But one crucial thing separated their outfits from modern couture. These dresses were almost never washed. Laundry, to the average royal lady, was something whispered about in servant quarters, a sort of dark, mysterious ritual involving water, fire, and possibly witchcraft. The truth was, most royal garments were far too expensive, delicate, and elaborately constructed to risk being scrubbed, soaked, or even slightly dampened. Instead, dresses were aired out. That's right, hung near a window for a few hours and called fresh. If a court gown had hosted a week of banquets, a christening, and mild trench foot, no problem. Just drape it near a breeze and hope the perfume kicks in before the bacteria do. And we're not talking about just outerwear. These were full outfits, with layers upon layers, chemise, petticoats, stays, corsets, gowns, trains, all of which absorbed a rotating mixture of sweat, body oils, food spills, and powdered wig fallout. If that dress could talk, it would beg to be burned. In some courts, undergarments were slightly more washable, but only slightly. Linen chemises were worn next to the skin and sometimes got a rinse. But when washing meant boiling clothes in lye and beating them with wooden paddles, most queens preferred the ignore and spritz approach. Even more charmingly, dresses were often shared. Not among equals, of course, that would be peasantry, but among ladies in waiting and younger nobles. Hand-me-down, in royal terms, meant someone else's dried sweat and perfume crusted into taffeta. To maintain appearances, many queens had dozens, even hundreds of gowns, not so they could rotate them for hygiene, but so no one saw them in the same outfit twice. It was about fashion, not freshness. Cleanliness was optional, being seen as poor, unthinkable. By the 17th and 18th centuries, European royal courts had collectively decided that growing one's own hair was for peasants and monks. Instead, wigs became the height of royal fashion. The bigger, whiter, and more structurally ambitious, the better. For royal women, this wasn't just about hiding thinning hair or grey strands. It was about declaring social superiority through the medium of detachable head furniture. Some of these wigs stood over a foot tall, powdered to a ghostly pallor, using flour or starch, then decorated with bows, feathers, artificial flowers, and, in extreme cases, miniature ships complete with sails. Yes, there were women out there walking around with naval battles happening on their heads. And you thought your hair mousse was excessive? Now here's the unwashed truth. Wigs were rarely, if ever, cleaned. You couldn't just shampoo and go. These things were glued, sewn, or pinned on, and the idea of dismantling them regularly was about as appealing as bathing. Instead, the wigs were simply dusted with powder and left to marinate. Enter the lice. These lush, flower-covered nests provided 5-star accommodations for head lice. The warm base, organic powder, and general lack of disturbance made it paradise for any insect with ambition. Queens and duchesses weren't oblivious to this. They just had tools. Enter the louse stick, a long, thin, bejeweled rod used to gracefully scratch one's scalp in public while pretending to be deep in thought. If that sounds grim, it gets better. Rodents sometimes joined the party. Mice were drawn to the powdered wigs, possibly mistaking them for pastry or nesting material. And there are recorded cases of ladies waking up to discover their hairpiece had been gnawed overnight. This led to the invention of wig cages, small wire enclosures placed around the head while sleeping, presumably next to a candle and one's sense of dignity. And yet, these towering disasters were considered beautiful, a symbol of wealth, cleanliness, ironically, and fashion. The more powder you wore, the less your enemies could see you sweat. So the next time your conditioner disappoints you, be thankful. At least your hair doesn't require scaffolding, rodent traps, or a separate storage room. And if it does, congratulations, Your Majesty. Every royal court had its symbols of power: crowns, sceptres, thrones, and for many noblewomen, a long, fancy stick for scratching lice out of their powdered scalps. These weren't your average twigs from the garden. They were called louse sticks, elegant, ivory or gold-plated tools with dainty handles and disturbingly specific utility. Wielded like a wand, they allowed queens and countesses to casually excavate their heads in public, all while maintaining perfect posture and pretending nothing was wrong. Of course, something was very wrong. When your towering wig is basically a baguette with feathers, filled with starch and dreams, you're going to have visitors. And when those visitors start biting, you can't just scream and slap your head like a peasant. You gently scratch, with grace, and hope no one notices the look of pure, unfiltered relief on your face. Court etiquette didn't stop at which fork to use. It also dictated how one should dig for lice. There were rules. Too aggressive, and you looked uncouth. Too delicate, and you risked missing the target entirely. The ideal technique was a slow, almost thoughtful motion, like you were pondering the fate of the kingdom, not trying to skewer an insect crawling behind your ear. Some louse sticks were so ornamental they looked like hairpins or jewellery. Others had compartments for scented oils, so you could dab perfume onto your scalp while performing pest control. That's multitasking at its finest. There were even court rumours about who scratched the most, and who pretended not to, out of sheer pride. A duchess might rather endure the itching than admit she'd been colonised. Vanity knows no limits, especially when your hairstyle weighs more than a toddler. Lice weren't the only concern. With all that powder, wigs often became itchy, flaky, and vaguely crusty. A louse stick might not even be used for bugs. Sometimes it was just to dig through a blizzard of starch and regret to reach your own skin. If you thought lice were the final boss of medieval hairstyling, allow us to introduce you to a more ambitious intruder: mice. Yes, real, whiskered, nibble-happy mice. You see, royal wigs, especially in the 18th century, were often so voluminous, so thoroughly dusted in flour and animal fat, and so frequently ignored by water and logic, that they became ideal nesting sites. Think about it. Warm, stationary, rich in edible starches. From a rodent's perspective, it was Airbnb perfection. These wigs weren't just hairpieces, they were architectural undertakings. Picture 3 feet of padded horsehair, wood framing, wire supports, and powdered pastry. Place that on your head, sleep in it, don't wash it, add a little ambient cheese nearby. You've basically put up a glowing vacancy sign for small mammals. And so, mice came. Silently, boldly, at night. Many noblewomen learned this the hard way, waking up to the soft, scratchy realization that their hairstyle had been repurposed into a rodent duplex. Others didn't even know until a squeak betrayed the intruder mid-curtsy. Nothing says elegance quite like a mouse diving out of your coiffure during a diplomatic banquet. To counter this growing rodent housing crisis, some women began sleeping with wire wig cages, essentially medieval hair helmets designed to keep animals out of their hair while they slept. Yes, queens and duchesses willingly put on metal contraptions, just to ensure they didn't wake up as Cinderella's evil stepsister and her mouse landlord. Did it work? Occasionally. But mostly, it added insult to injury. The beauty sleep of royal women now included lice, migraines, neck cramps, and rodent proofing. All for a hairstyle that, from afar, made them look like an over-decorated wedding cake with trust issues. But what mattered wasn't hygiene. It was the spectacle. Fashion was about display, not practicality. A towering wig, even one harbouring a small ecosystem, still signalled wealth, status, and glorious detachment from the struggles of the human body. What do you get when you mix vinegar, white lead, and societal expectations? the 18th century royal skincare routine. Royal women were obsessed with achieving the porcelain look, pale, smooth, and glowing with the freshness of someone who hadn't seen sunlight or criticism in a decade. The ideal complexion wasn't just about beauty, it signaled wealth, nobility, and the fact that you didn't have to work outside or acknowledge the peasants. Unfortunately, Mother Nature rarely handed out naturally poreless, moon-pale skin. So royal women turned to a little home chemistry, and by home, we mean arsenal. The most infamous product was called Venetian ceruse, a paste made from white lead and vinegar. Applied generously to the face, neck and chest, it provided a flawless finish and slowly destroyed everything underneath. Skin peeled, sores developed, hair fell out. But for a brief, glimmering moment, they looked stunning in candlelight. Side effects were brushed off as sensitivity or delicate constitution. Never mind that many women developed lead poisoning, lost their teeth, or ended up looking like a melting candle. The important thing was that they appeared ethereal while doing it. Makeup wasn't applied subtly either. This wasn't no makeup. This was layer until your pores surrender. Thick white base, bright red cheeks made from mercury-based rouge, and a beauty mark, sometimes to cover a festering sore caused by yesterday's beauty mark. And let's talk about those beauty marks, or mouches, as they were fashionably called. Made of velvet, silk, or mouse fur. Yes, real mouse fur, because apparently they weren't done with mice yet. These little patches were glued on strategically. One near the mouth said, flirtatious. Near the eye meant passionate. On the chin, poisoned but still photogenic. Eventually, skin damage became so bad that women applied even more ceruse to cover it, leading to a delightful cycle of decay and denial. So the next time your concealer creases or you're found, if eyes are the windows to the soul, then royal mouths were often trapdoors to despair. Despite the palaces, pearls and powdered faces, the dental health of royal women was, how shall we put this gently, a medieval horror show with jewels on top. Sugar had arrived in Europe and was quickly embraced by the nobility, not as a treat, but as a personality trait. And royal women, eager to show off their refined taste and perhaps drown their sorrows in marzipan, consumed sugar like it was a vitamin. The result? Teeth that staged revolts. Rot, abscesses and blackened molars were not uncommon, but instead of flossing, which hadn't been invented, and even if it had, would have been seen as suspiciously hygienic, royal ladies simply stopped using their teeth. Meals were mashed, stewed, or turned into mush. If you couldn't eat it with a spoon or drink it through a grimace, it wasn't worth chewing. Queen Elizabeth I of England, famed for her dazzling court and terrifying intellect, reportedly had such decayed teeth in her later years that foreign diplomats complained they couldn't understand her speech. When your smile has the acoustics of a broken piano, diplomacy becomes interpretive dance. To hide the damage, women kept their mouths mostly closed in portraits and practice. Smiling with teeth was considered crude anyway. That was for tavern wenches and toddlers. A royal woman's best accessory was mystery. And if that mystery smelled faintly of clove oil and necrosis, so be it. To combat the decay, without, brushing, some royal women rinsed with honey wine, chewed herbs, or stuck cloves in their mouths like fragrant molars. Others used early tooth powders, mixtures of crushed bones, oyster shells and cinnamon, which, shockingly, did not reverse cavities. If a tooth had to be removed, it was done without anaesthetic, and often by the local barber, because apparently cutting hair and ripping molars were neighbouring skill sets. You might assume that royal women of the past wore elaborate undergarments beneath their silks and velvets, corsets, petticoats, maybe something resembling underwear. You would, of course, be wrong, because for much of history, royal women wore absolutely nothing under all those layers. Yes, beneath the brocade, the lace, and the 12-pound beaded gown, it was often just a draught and a prayer. The concept of underpants, even in their most primitive, dignity-preserving form, was considered either too masculine or too peasant-like. Breeches were for men, undershorts were for field workers. A noblewoman. She was expected to be so elevated, so ethereal, that her lower half presumably existed only in theory. Now, to be fair, many women did wear a linen shift or chemise, a basic smock that served as a kind of washable barrier between their skin and all the unwashed finery. But under that, no drawers, no knickers, just the breeze of divine right and perhaps a hint of rosewater. This created a number of royal inconveniences, especially when nature called. Imagine trying to delicately hover over a chamber pot while balancing a 30-pound gown, corset, panniers, and zero elastic support. The process was a logistical performance, usually requiring a maid, a prayer, and excellent thigh strength. Enter the bordaloo, a small, gravy boat-shaped urinal made for noble women to use discreetly under their skirts during long carriage rides or tedious audiences, because nothing says graceful diplomacy like peeing in porcelain while discussing succession laws. Even when underpants did start appearing in aristocratic wardrobes, late 18th century and beyond, they were often viewed as suspiciously French, scandalously practical, or simply unnecessary for a woman of breeding. Modesty, it turns out, had its limits, especially when weighed against 14 layers of embroidered silk and ceremonial duty. Royal fashion was designed to dazzle, to awe, to intimidate, and ideally, to squeeze the wearer within an inch of her life. But somewhere between the embroidered corsets and fur-lined gowns, many royal women discovered an unadvertised feature of luxury clothing: violent allergic reactions. The materials that screamed nobility also whispered itchy death trap. Silk was nice, sure, but it was often treated with mercury, arsenic, or toxic dyes to achieve those luscious blues and blood-rich crimsons. Lace came from questionable sources, stiffened with wax or even lead-based starch. And fur, well, fur looked great until it started molting inside your sleeves mid-banquet, triggering sneezes, rashes, and the occasional existential crisis. But none of this mattered to the royal tailor. The goal wasn't comfort, it was silhouette, symbolism, and whether the Pope would faint from how expensive you looked. Corsets were the crown jewel of medieval and Renaissance wardrobe torture. Made from whalebone, wood, and occasionally straight-up metal, these stiff marbles compressed the torso into fashionable submission. But they also cut into the skin, triggered eczema, and made deep breathing a nostalgic memory. Let's not forget the jewellery, because nothing says elegance like a necklace that gives you hives. Royal women draped themselves in pearls, rubies, and gold-plated copper. Copper, it turns out, can turn your skin green, but that's fine as long as it matched your dress. Then came the layers. Oh, the glorious, unbreathable layers. Winter, you boiled. Summer, you marinated. No ventilation, no moisture-wicking fabric. Just you, 6 petticoats, and the distant sound of your skin breaking out in hives. And because some outfits were stitched onto the body, literally sewn into place, if you started swelling, blistering, or reacting mid-process, your options were smile through the burning, blame it on the peasants. Develop a reputation for being sensitive, which in court terms meant you still had nerve endings. So while peasants worried about famine, disease, and taxes, royal women were out here trying to survive a murderous blouse made of beetle dye and whale cartilage. Fashion kills, they say. Royal fashion just did it with pearls and perfect posture. You might assume that royal women, with access to palaces, servants, and silk everything, enjoyed regular relaxing baths, the kind with rose petals, candles, and a string quartet playing in the background. You would be adorable for thinking that. In reality, bathing was treated with the same enthusiasm as dental surgery. Medieval and Renaissance physicians often believed that too much bathing could open the pores and let in disease. So rather than risk a fatal draught or spontaneous moral decay, many royal women opted for the smell-like power approach. When a bath was scheduled, say once every few months or for a coronation emergency, it was an ordeal. First, a giant wooden tub had to be hauled into the room. Then servants carried dozens of buckets of water from the kitchen, upstairs, down halls, past confused dignitaries, and into the tub. Heating it required a fire, time, and usually someone's will to live. Once the water was ready, royal bathing protocol kicked in. A lady never bathed alone, not because of romance or security, but because someone had to hold her up while she tried not to drown in 40 pounds of embroidered modesty. Nakedness was rarely total. Some bathed in linen shifts to preserve modesty, which also conveniently trapped the grime against their skin. Oh, and the water. Not changed. If multiple family members were bathing, the eldest or most noble went first. Everyone else followed, like a very wet, very unsanitary social ladder. Some bathtubs even became semi-permanent furniture, with cushions, trays for food, and wine goblets balanced precariously next to tepid soup water. Because nothing says soothing self-care like soaking in royal broth with a side of boar meat. After the bath, instead of drying off with a fluffy towel, which didn't exist, noble women were rubbed down with linen cloths or patted with fine powders, some of which contained lead, chalk, or flower petals, because covering up the stink was easier than removing it. Menstruation, the thing nobody wanted to talk about, especially if you were a royal woman expected to be ethereal, divine, and eternally unstained. Unfortunately, biology didn't care about etiquette, and so, once a month, the ladies of the court faced a very human problem beneath their gowns: the royal period. Tampons? Nope. Pads? Not exactly. Modern menstrual products didn't exist, and even the concept of sanitary was more of a vague aspiration than a lifestyle. What noble women used instead were rags, cloth rolls, sponges, and prayer. The most common method involved tying softened linen rags to a belt worn under the dress, essentially strapping a napkin to your body and hoping for the best. If the linen slipped, congratulations. You've just become the Duchess who stained the throne. Literally. In public, of course, everything had to appear serene and bloodless. If a royal lady felt cramps or dizziness, she was described as delicate, moody, or simply unwell, which in court language could mean anything from PMS to poisoning to political sabotage. Privacy was also limited. A lady-in-waiting was always nearby, ready to assist with dress lifting, fabric retying, and quiet crisis control. There were no private bathrooms, just chamber pots and screen dividers, and the terrifying knowledge that someone probably heard everything. And here's the real twist. Menstruation was political. A missed period meant whispers about pregnancy, legitimacy, succession. A period that came too often was labelled unnatural. Bleeding was never just bleeding. It was gossip fuel, family drama, and court intrigue all rolled into one bodily function. Queen Anne of England, for instance, suffered 17 pregnancies, many ending in miscarriage or stillbirth, and every drop of blood she shed was interpreted like a prophetic omen. Because heaven forbid a woman just have a uterus. The church wasn't much help either. Menstruating women were once barred from touching holy relics, entering sacred spaces, or doing basically anything that might offend God with their unapologetic humanity. When we picture royal women, we often imagine pristine gowns fluttering in the breeze, silk glinting in the sunlight, and everything smelling faintly of lavender and smugness. The truth? Their clothes were rarely washed, and when they were, it was with the full reluctance and spiritual suffering of every servant involved. Most royal garments weren't just fancy, they were architectural, made of silk, velvet, brocade, fur, and enough lace to snare a deer. These outfits couldn't simply be tossed into a wash basin. Water ruined expensive fabric, soap faded dyes, and scrubbing risked damage. So instead of cleaning the clothes, everyone just ignored the problem. Dresses were aired out, brushed down, and perfumed into submission. The logic was simple. If it smelled like roses and clove oil, it must be clean, right? Never mind the fact that sweat, smoke, food stains, and the occasional bodily emergency were trapped inside like ghosts in a brocade prison. Undergarments, usually linen shifts, were technically washable, but even those weren't washed often. Why? Because laundry was labour-intensive, expensive, and, let's be honest, no one wanted to handle royal armpit rags. Servants assigned to laundry duty had one of the most dreaded jobs in the palace. Washing involved dragging garments to the nearest water source, heating enormous cauldrons, scrubbing by hand, and then wrestling with drying and pressing it all flat with literal slabs of iron. It was so exhausting that some households had dedicated laundress quarters, aka misery huts, and if something ripped or stained beyond redemption, it was passed down to a lower-ranking lady-in-waiting. Congratulations, your status is now hand-me-down stench receiver. Some monarchs took this to majestic extremes. Empress Josephine, wife of Napoleon, reportedly changed gowns several times a day, not because she washed them, but because she never wore the same filthy dress twice. The dresses piled up, somewhere, probably still radiating. For royal women, personal hygiene wasn't so much a routine as it was a seasonal suggestion. Cleanliness, after all, was a fickle thing, like fashionable fruit or stable airs. You didn't do it regularly. You did it strategically, and preferably when it wouldn't kill you. Bathing in winter? Absolutely not. That was basically an open invitation for pneumonia to waltz in and ruin the dynasty. The prevailing wisdom said warm water opened your pores, and open pores let in disease. So in colder months, most royal women opted to layer their filth, not remove it. Instead of soap and water, they turned to perfume, powders, and an almost supernatural confidence. A spritz of rose oil here, a puff of violet powder there, and voila, you've disguised 3 weeks of armpit build-up with something vaguely floral and deeply misleading. Summer wasn't much better. Bathing was more acceptable, sure, but still rare and laborious. On particularly hot days, a royal lady might dab her face with rose-water-soaked cloths or freshen up by changing her linen shift. The 16th century equivalent of spraying deodorant over yesterday's disaster, and let's not forget the hair. With washing off the table for most of the year, royal women resorted to dry shampoo in its earliest and most questionable form. Powdered starch mixed with perfume and hope. They'd cake it into their scalps until the oil was absorbed or, more realistically, until the powder turned grey and flaked off onto the furniture. Even brushing teeth followed the seasonal rhythm. Mint leaves, vinegar rinses and tooth powders made from ground oyster shells were used more in summer, when bad breath had a shorter fuse in the heat. In winter, let it stew. No one would dare comment on a queen's halitosis when she was already dying of cold and politics. Ultimately, hygiene was less about actual cleanliness and more about managing perceptions. If you looked composed and smelled vaguely like a spice merchant's widow, you were winning. The dirt, the odours, the occasional parasitic sidekick, that was all just part of the royal ecosystem. So next time you skip a shower and call it self-care, just remember, you're in excellent historical company. By the end of a royal woman's hygiene cycle, and we use cycle generously, what you had was a person draped in gold, lace, and at least 3 layers of floral panic. When you couldn't clean yourself and bathing was a once-a-season flirtation with death, you did the next best thing. You weaponized perfume. Perfume wasn't a luxury. It was a defensive measure. Much like powdered wigs or inherited titles, it served to hide the truth beneath a layer of powdered denial. Every royal woman had her signature scent, but not in the "this reminds me of spring" way. No, this was survival. This was, I've not bathed since Michaelmas, but still need to host an ambassador. Scents came in oils, tinctures, pomanders, and scented gloves. Rosewater, lavender, ambergris, violet, clove, and sometimes musk, which, fun fact, was literally scraped from the gland of a deer that regretted everything. The point wasn't to smell good. The point was to smell like money and mystery. And when it got especially dire, enter the vinaigrette necklace, a tiny, fashionable container that held a sponge soaked in vinegar or perfume. Women would clutch it, discreetly inhale, and pretend they weren't drowning in their own atmospheric soup. In crowded courts, this layering of scents created a chemical fog of passive-aggressive elegance. You'd walk into a ballroom and immediately get hit with 15 flavours of floral terror and exactly 0 evidence that anyone owned soap. Power, after all, didn't need to be clean. It needed to be presentable. A queen might reek beneath her satin, but if her perfume was strong enough, people would bow anyway. If her gloves smelled like imported spices, no one cared that her fingernails hadn't seen daylight in weeks. The perfumes were so strong that some guests fainted. Others just adjusted their expectations of nobility to include burnt nostrils and political nausea. So in the end, hygiene for royal women wasn't about health. It was about illusion. Power smelled like violets, cloves, and fear. And honestly, that was still an improvement over the alternative. In Edo, Japan, rice wasn't just a staple food, it was the heartbeat of the entire society. Imagine a world where your salary, status, and even your taxes were measured not in coins, but in bags of rice. That was life under the Tokugawa shogunate. A samurai's income was calculated in koku, enough rice to feed one man for a year. Even peasants at the very bottom of the social pyramid were considered valuable based on how much rice they could produce. But let's clear something up. When we say rice, we're not talking about a quick microwave bag or something you toss in a rice cooker. This was polished white rice, milled carefully to remove the husk, considered a luxury compared to the rough brown rice the poorer classes often had to eat. And it wasn't just eaten plain. Rice was shaped into balls, wrapped in seaweed, or served with pickled vegetables and dried fish. Onigiri, anyone? Yep, it's older than your favourite anime. For the wealthy, daimyos, court nobles, and the top-tier samurai, rice was paired with rich side dishes. Things like grilled eel, unagi, sweetened black beans, or even delicacies like sea bream and miso-marinated tofu. But for the average townsfolk or countryside labourer, the typical meal looked like a modest bowl of rice, miso soup, and a piece of pickled daikon radish, if they were lucky. However, rice wasn't only food, it had a spiritual weight. Offerings of rice were made to household gods and ancestors. Rice was consumed during religious festivals, weddings, and funerals. Even the act of eating it was infused with ritual. Don't stick your chopsticks upright in the rice bowl unless you want someone to think you're hosting a funeral. And here's a twist. Rice was so central to society that too much of it could make you sick. The rich who indulged exclusively in white rice often suffered from beriberi, a vitamin deficiency, while the poorer classes, who ate less refined rice and a more varied diet, often had better nutrition. If rice was the body of the Edo meal, miso soup was its soul. And no, this wasn't the watery stuff in a paper cup you get at sushi chains. In Edo, Japan, miso soup was a daily ritual, a culinary anchor that spanned all classes, from the dirt-caked peasant to the polished samurai sharpening his katana. At its core, miso soup is made from miso paste, which is fermented soybeans mashed into a salty, umami-rich sludge. Sounds glamorous, doesn't it? But miso was practically magical. It could last forever, adapt to any season, and nourish your gut before probiotics were even a thing. Edo housewives would make huge batches at home, tucking clay crocks of fermenting soybeans into dark corners like edible treasure chests. But miso soup wasn't just soy water. The broth was built on dashi, a stock made from dried bonito flakes and kelp. This added layers of smoky, briny complexity that would make any modern chef cry tears of joy. Into this hot, aromatic broth went tofu cubes, sliced scallions, strips of wakame seaweed, and maybe a stray clam or two if you lived near the coast and weren't completely broke. And here's the kicker. There wasn't just one kind of miso. Different regions used different fermentation techniques. Red miso, aka miso, was strong and salty, while white miso, shiro miso, was sweeter and lighter. There was even hacho miso, a dense, dark miso favoured in samurai households for its rich, hearty profile. Imagine showing off your regional miso the way we flex craft beers today. Even spiritually, miso had weight. Buddhist monks relied on miso-based soups during their vegetarian fasts. Some believed miso soup balanced the body's energies, harmonizing yin and yang. Others just thought it was warm and tasty, and frankly, that's enough. The peasant version of miso soup might be thin, with only radish peels or wild greens tossed in, while the merchant class might have seasonal delicacies like bamboo shoots or shiitake mushrooms floating in theirs. But rich or poor, no meal in Edo, Japan was complete without a steaming bowl of miso soup, humble, hearty, and deeply human. And if you ever skipped it, well, that was practically a culinary sin. A day without miso was a day your ancestors probably frowned at you from the shrine. Welcome to the crunchy, salty, nose-wrinkling world of Edo period pickles, or as the Japanese called them, tsukemono. If rice was the main character and miso soup the supporting role, pickles were that scene-stealing sidekick who didn't say much, but always left a strong impression, usually on your taste buds. Pickled foods weren't just garnish, they were essential to survival. Japan's humid summers and cold winters made food preservation a must, especially in rural villages where refrigerators were as mythical as dragons. So what did people do? They took everything from daikon radishes to cucumbers, eggplants, plums, and even burdock root, and pickled them within an inch of their lives. The most iconic? That would be the bright yellow pickled daikon, also known as takuan. Named after a Zen monk, takuan wasn't just tangy, it was practically a spiritual experience. It was believed to cleanse the palate, aid digestion, and quite frankly, keep you from dying of boredom when your third meal in a row was just rice and soup again. Then there was umeboshi, pickled plums so sour they could make a sumo wrestler cry. Samurai would pack these in their rice balls when going to battle, not just because they lasted forever, but because they were believed to ward off fatigue, disease, and possibly demons. Spoiler, the demons were probably just indigestion. Fermented pickles, like nukazuki, were another Edo specialty. They were made by burying vegetables in a bed of fermented rice bran and letting time do its thing. Every household had its own nuka bed, which had to be stirred by hand daily to keep it alive. That's right, alive. Neglect your pickle bed, and it could turn on you. It was like having a pet, but it tasted like vinegar. These pickles weren't just practical, they were cultural and symbolic. Offerings of pickled vegetables were made at shrines. Meals were judged incomplete without them. Even in the strict dietary codes of Buddhist monks, certain pickles were allowed as the rare pop of flavour in an otherwise bland existence. And let's be honest, when your day consists of back-breaking labour or endless etiquette at court, biting into something crunchy, salty, and eye-wateringly strong is one of life's few legal pleasures. In Edo, Japan, pickles weren't a side dish. They were a way of life. Edo wasn't just a city. It was a roaring, bustling, pre-industrial megapolis with over 1 million people, more than London or Paris at the time. And with that many stomachs rumbling, you'd better believe street food wasn't just popular. It was a way of survival, convenience, and community. Enter the yatai, wooden food stalls that popped up along bridges, canals, and street corners like mushrooms after a rainstorm. These were the Edo equivalent of food trucks, minus the wheels, refrigeration, or any sense of hygiene. But what they lacked in food safety, they made up for in flavour, speed, and affordability. So what was on the menu? For starters, soba noodles. Buckwheat soba was the street food MVP, cheap, filling, and easy to slurp. You could get it hot in winter or chilled in summer, dunked in a rich soy-based broth. There were even special soba shops that delivered, on foot. Couriers balanced stacked boxes of noodles on long shoulder poles, sprinting through narrow alleys like very hungry ninjas. Then came odon, a kind of simmered stew with boiled eggs, daikon radish, tofu, and konnyaku, served straight from a pot bubbling over charcoal. Customers would grab a quick skewer and stand there, steam rising into the crisp Edo air, warming both hands and belly. And who could forget grilled eel, or unagi? Smoky, sweet, glazed with soy and mirin, it was considered a stamina booster, especially in the sweltering summer months. Wealthier commoners might splurge on a skewer or two, pretending, just for a moment, that they were as important as a minor daimyo. Oh, And for dessert, how about sweet potato candies, roasted chestnuts, or glutinous rice cakes dusted in soybean flour? Kids with a few coins and adults with a sweet tooth could always find something sticky and satisfying. Of course, this street food scene came with some class snobbery. Samurai were technically discouraged from eating while walking, as it was considered undignified. But that didn't stop more than a few from sneaking a quick bite of soba on their way to the next duel or poetry recital. Street food in Edo wasn't just fuel. It was fast, flavorful, and woven into the daily rhythm of the city. It was a place where the merchant, the monk, and the mud-caked labourer could all slurp side by side, united by hunger and the heavenly scent of sizzling soy. Samurai may have been warriors, poets, and bureaucrats, but let's be clear, they still had to eat. And while you might imagine them feasting on wild boar between battles, the truth is a little less cinematic. The Edo period samurai diet was a strange mix of discipline, austerity, and the occasional culinary flex. Let's start with the basics. Most samurai ate 2 meals a day, breakfast and dinner. Lunch was for the weak. Their meals typically featured, you guessed it, rice, miso soup, and pickled vegetables. Sound familiar? That's because the warrior elite didn't eat all that differently from the peasants, at least on ordinary days. However, they had access to higher quality ingredients. Their rice was polished, their miso was richer, and their pickles were the fancy, hand-massaged kind, not the buried it in a clay pot and hope for the best variety. They also had side dishes that hinted at their elevated status: dried sea bream, grilled river fish, or tofu grilled with sesame sauce. But make no mistake, gluttony was frowned upon. Samurai were expected to be models of self-restraint, not lunchroom legends. Overeating was seen as unseemly, even dishonourable. A true warrior should be able to fight, ride, and compose haiku on an empty stomach. Still, there were exceptions. During banquets, weddings, or political gatherings, samurai tables could suddenly look like a pre-modern tasting menu. Platters of seasonal vegetables, nimono, simmered dishes, yakimono, grilled fish, and sweets made from bean paste or chestnut flour. But even then, presentation was everything. Meals were served in lacquerware, arranged with an eye for symmetry and colour. A samurai didn't just eat. He communed with his meal like it was a reluctant ally. One interesting twist: no red meat. The consumption of 4-legged animals was considered taboo, especially for the ruling classes. Samurai diets were heavily pescatarian: fish, shellfish, seaweed. If someone served you beef, they were either a foreigner or very, very bold. And tea, so much tea. A proper meal often ended with a quiet cup of green tea, as the samurai contemplated life, death, or maybe just whether the daikon had been pickled long enough. So, what did the samurai diet teach us? That even the toughest warriors needed their fibre. And that discipline didn't stop at the sword. It continued right onto the plate. While the samurai were sipping tea and meditating over sesame tofu, the peasants, the folks who actually kept the country alive, were out in the fields, burning calories like it was an Olympic sport. And when they finally stumbled home, sunburned and sore, they weren't greeted by grilled eel or porcelain dishes. No, they were eating meals that were humble, hearty, and borderline miraculous in their inventiveness. Let's start with the main course. Millet or brown rice, depending on how generous the land taxes had been that year. Remember, much of the polished white rice was siphoned off to pay the government or feed the upper classes. What remained for the farmer was often mixed with barley, millet, or even sweet potatoes. Whatever could stretch a sack of grain just a little further. Protein, rare and precious. Tofu was a peasant's best friend. It was cheap, easy to make, and didn't involve chasing anything around. Occasionally, families added natto, fermented soybeans with the consistency of snot and the smell of revenge, but packed with nutrition. It was either a superfood or a dare, depending on your perspective. And then there were the greens. Wild mountain vegetables like ferns, burdock root, and mugwort were foraged and boiled into soups or stir-fried. Farming families often pickled their own radishes and cucumbers in earthen jars buried behind the house. If lucky, they might add a sliver of dried sardine or a dollop of miso for flavour. But here's where peasant cooking really shined. Resourcefulness. Nothing went to waste. That tough stem, boil it into soup. That stale rice, turn it into rice gruel or dry it into crackers. Ashes from the hearth were even used to preserve food or neutralise bitterness in certain wild plants. These weren't meals, they were edible survival manuals. Dessert? Don't be cute. If a farmer had a sweet tooth, he'd nibble on a roasted sweet potato, or, on a festival day, maybe enjoy a mochi ball offered at the shrine. For the other 360 days of the year, chewing slowly was your only indulgence. Despite their simplicity, these meals were surprisingly nutritionally balanced, fibrous, fermented, full of seasonal variety. Edo peasants may not have had sushi chefs or fancy kitchens, but what they lacked in luxury, they made up for with cleverness, frugality, and the sheer will to not starve. And honestly, that deserves a Michelin star in its own right. Now let's talk about the real party. Edo's pleasure quarters, where food wasn't just sustenance, it was seduction on a plate. In the ukiyo, or floating world, geisha, kabuki actors, poets, and rich merchants mingled in a haze of perfume, lantern light, and elaborate meals that bordered on performance art. Welcome to the yukaku, the licensed red light districts, where a good meal could be as intoxicating as a good flirtation. Patrons didn't just eat to fill their bellies. They dined to impress, to woo, to showcase status. And the dishes? Extravagant. We're talking lacquered boxes of seasonal delicacies, sashimi arranged like flower gardens, tiny grilled riverfish placed just so. Every course whispered, "I'm richer than you, and yes, that is a gold leaf on my soup." This was the birthplace of kaiseki-style dining, a multi-course meal that emphasized balance, beauty, and seasonality. Each dish arrived like a poem, daikon carved into cranes, tofu shaped like plum blossoms, bowls painted with maple leaves to match the real ones falling outside. It was food as philosophy, curated to reflect harmony between nature, time, and human pleasure. Drinks flowed too. Sake, the ever-present social lubricant of the Edo elite. Served warm or chilled, depending on the season, it came in porcelain cups no bigger than thimbles, ensuring constant refills and conversation. Pair your drink with salted squid guts, shiokara, or dried fugu skin, because what's a little neurotoxin between friends? In this hedonistic orbit, food and art were inseparable. Dishes were referenced in haiku, ukiyo-e prints, and kabuki plays. A poet might compare love to a bowl of cold noodles, fleeting, slippery, and best enjoyed before it sours. But for all its beauty, this was also a world of contrast. The opulent meals of the Yoshiwara district stood in stark relief to the rice gruel of farmers just a few miles away. It was a feast built on inequality, fantasy, and the illusion of permanence. Still, for those lucky enough to enter this world, even for a night, the food of the floating world wasn't just nourishment. It was escapism, lavish, poetic, and slightly scandalous. A full stomach, flushed cheeks, and a wallet considerably lighter. That was the price of pleasure in Edo's most decadent dining rooms. While the pleasure districts were busy turning food into an artful flirtation, high up in the misty mountains and quiet temple courtyards, another culinary tradition flourished, one built on silence, simplicity, and self-denial. Welcome to the world of Shojin Ryori, the strictly vegetarian cuisine of Buddhist monks in Edo, Japan. No meat, no fish, no garlic or onions either. They were thought to stir impure desires. So what does that leave you with? Quite a lot, actually, if you're incredibly patient and have the knife skills of a demigod. The whole philosophy of Shojin Ryori was about mindful preparation, balance, and harmony, with nature, the seasons, and your digestive tract. Meals were typically served in sets of 5, following the Buddhist principle of 5 flavors, 5 colors, and 5 cooking methods. That means every meal included salty, sweet, sour, bitter, and umami. You'd see combinations like grilled eggplant glazed with miso, tofu simmered in dashi made from kelp and mushrooms, and root vegetables cut into perfect meditative slices. All served in black lacquer bowls, all eerily quiet except for the sound of chewing and enlightenment setting in. The monks' kitchens were surprisingly sophisticated. They made tofu look like eel, crafted yuba, tofu skin, into delicate rolls, and turned mountain yams into silky purees that somehow made you forget bacon ever existed. Okay, maybe not forget, but at least forgive. There was also seasonal reverence. Autumn meant simmered chestnuts and lotus root. Spring brought bamboo shoots and sansai, wild mountain herbs. Food wasn't just seasonal, it was sacred, a way to connect with the world through what you chose to put in your bowl, or more importantly, what you chose to leave out. And despite being based on restraint, Shojin Ryori was often visually stunning. Carefully plated, balanced in texture and temperature, it was the kind of food that forced you to slow down. No gulping, no talking, no chasing the last pickle around with your chopsticks, just stillness and soy. In a world where eating was often about class, performance, or survival, Buddhist cuisine offered a third way. Eat to live to reflect, and maybe reach enlightenment one pickled turnip at a time. It wasn't flashy, but it was profound, and remarkably tasty for something that didn't even allow garlic. If you asked an Edo period chef what their most important ingredient was, they probably wouldn't say soy sauce or miso, they'd say thyme. Because in Edo, Japan, food wasn't just eaten, it was observed, waited for, and deeply tied to the seasons. Forget spice racks or imported sauces. The real flavour came from knowing exactly when a bamboo shoot was sweetest, or when a persimmon would practically melt in your mouth. This wasn't about being fancy. It was about survival first, harmony second. Japan's climate offered 4 intense distinct seasons, and every household, from samurai mansions to muddy farm huts, adapted their meals accordingly. You ate what grew when it grew, and how nature intended. And when something wasn't in season, tough luck. No tomatoes in January, no cucumbers in December. The land gave what it gave, and you said thank you. Spring meant fresh greens, fiddlehead ferns, young bamboo shoots, wild herbs, boiled gently and served with sesame sauce. Summer brought cooling dishes like chilled soba, pickled cucumbers, and water-heavy fruits like melons and peaches. Autumn was a parade of mushrooms, chestnuts, and grilled river fish. And winter? Simmered root vegetables, piping hot miso soups, and preserved daikon from the pickle jars you buried in October. Even food presentation mirrored the seasons. Plates were decorated with real maple leaves in fall, or cherry blossoms in spring. Dishes were chosen for colour contrast. Cool blue ceramics in summer, warm earth tones in winter. You didn't just taste the season. You saw it, felt it, and even heard it in the crunch of a roasted sweet potato on a frosty morning. This seasonal awareness wasn't just tradition, it was deeply spiritual. Shinto beliefs emphasized nature's cycles, and Buddhist principles promoted mindfulness. Eating with the seasons meant you weren't just a consumer, you were a participant in the rhythm of the world. Modern food culture, with its year-round strawberries and jet-lagged avocados, might seem more convenient. But Edo cuisine reminds us that there's something powerful in waiting, in anticipating the first plum of the season or the last bowl of new rice harvest. In Edo, Japan, food wasn't just something you put in your mouth. It was a calendar, a compass, and a quiet teacher, reminding you that everything in life, even a humble meal, has its perfect time. Forget what you've heard about ancient filth. If there's one thing Romans took more seriously than their military formations or their wine goblets, it was bathing. To be Roman was to be clean, or at least to look like it. And not just clean, but steamed, scraped, oiled and rinsed like a prized marble statue. Bathing wasn't a once-a-week affair. For many Romans, it was daily, sometimes even twice. You might think, How luxurious. And yes, it was. But it was also expected. Much like today's morning coffee, a trip to the thermae, the public bathhouse, was part of the routine. You woke up, did some business, maybe yelled at a slave, and then headed to the baths to sweat and socialise. These bathhouses weren't small. Some were massive complexes, the size of football stadiums, complete with gyms, libraries, snack bars, gardens, and mosaics that would put your bathroom tiles to shame. The baths of Caracalla? They could hold over 1,600 people at once. That's not hygiene. That's a hygiene festival. But the Romans weren't just bathing to stay clean. In fact, there's a fair argument that genuine cleanliness was a secondary benefit. The baths were a place to see and be seen. Senators, gladiators, merchants, and philosophers all stripped down and mingled. It was networking, gossip, and politics, all done in sandals and nothing else. And don't assume it was just the elite. Entry to the baths was usually cheap, even free on certain days. Poor citizens, freedmen, and slaves could all enjoy the steamy serenity. It was one of the rare spaces in Roman society that blurred class lines, if only temporarily. Though of course, if you showed up without oil or a proper strigil, the curved metal tool for scraping sweat and grime, you'd probably get side-eyed into oblivion. The real obsession, though, wasn't the water. It was the ritual. The sequence of heat, cold, and grooming performed like a religious rite. Start in the apoditerium, changing room, proceed to the tepidarium, warm room, sweat in the caldarium, hot room, shock your soul in the frigidarium, cold plunge, and emerge radiant, oiled, and maybe slightly smug. You might think a bathhouse is just a big tub of water. The Romans would disagree, loudly, and with blueprints. Their bathhouses were architectural masterpieces, feats of engineering designed not just for hygiene, but for awe. These places weren't built to be functional. They were built to impress. Let's start with the layout. A standard Roman bathhouse followed a logical progression. You undressed in the apoditerium, warmed up in the tepidarium, roasted in the caldarium, then jumped into the frigidarium to cool off. But that's just the beginning. Some complexes had saunas, massage rooms, libraries, gardens, and even lecture halls. It wasn't so much a bathhouse as it was a civic temple disguised as a wellness centre. The real genius was underground, the Hippocos system. Imagine a giant subfloor heating grid fueled by roaring furnaces. Hot air flowed under the floors and through flues in the walls, creating toasty warm rooms in a time before electricity. Romans didn't just invent the indoor bath, they invented central heating while half of Europe was still trying to figure out thatching, and these buildings were gorgeous. Marble pillars, vaulted ceilings, mosaics of sea creatures and gods, statues of Hercules and Venus watching over your shampoo routine. Even the ceilings dripped opulence. The baths of Diocletian had ceilings 30 metres high, taller than some cathedrals. Because why not feel like a divine being while exfoliating? The scale wasn't just for show, it was a declaration. Rome has conquered comfort. No civilization before had created such spaces of public luxury on such a massive scale. It was a reminder that while other nations fought in mud, Romans soaked in style. But let's not pretend everyone was treated equally. The wealthy could afford private baths or reserved hours. The poorest bathed shoulder to shoulder with strangers, often with water that had seen a few too many backsides. Still, even the cheapest bathhouse had better plumbing than most medieval castles 1,000 years later. Walking into a Roman bathhouse wasn't like hopping into a hot tub. It was a precise, step-by-step ritual, carefully orchestrated to transform your sweaty, sand-dusted body into a glowing, oiled beacon of Roman civility. You didn't just get clean, you underwent a transformation worthy of a minor god. First stop, the apoditerium, the changing room. Here you'd strip down and hand your clothes to an attendant, ideally one you trusted, because theft was common and togas were not cheap. Wealthier bathers might even bring a slave whose only job was to watch their stuff. That's right. The Roman version of a locker room thief was alive and well. Next came the tepidarium, the warm room. This was the gentle introduction, a place to acclimate your body and start sweating. No hot plunge yet, just heated air, warm benches, and the first layer of gossip gently simmering around you. Then it was time to sweat like a gladiator in the caldarium, the hot room. This was the Roman sauna, steamy, sweltering, and fragrant with oils and perspiration. You'd sit, sweat, and maybe get a rub-down with perfumed oil. But the real fun came when you were handed a strigil, a curved metal scraper used to remove oil, dirt, and dead skin. Picture exfoliating with a butter knife while chatting about the latest Senate scandal. And just when you were melting like a candle, bam! The frigidarium, the cold plunge. One shockingly icy pool to snap your senses back into place. This was the Roman version of an espresso shot. Painful, invigorating, and utterly addictive. Then came the finishing touches. Another oiling, maybe a light massage, and a towel off with something slightly more luxurious than burlap. You emerged not just clean, but reborn, ready to face the dusty streets of Rome once again. But let's be clear, this wasn't optional. For many Romans, especially the upper classes, the bathing ritual was as necessary as breakfast. Skipping the baths was like skipping your public duties, or worse, skipping your chance to eavesdrop on political rivals in the steam room. If you thought Roman baths were just for cleansing the body, think again. These steamy sanctuaries doubled as the empire's favourite rumour mill. The caldarium wasn't just a hot room. It was a hotbed of gossip, deals, political plotting, and shameless flirting. You went in to sweat and came out with dirt on everyone else. Everyone who was anyone bathed. Senators, merchants, philosophers, generals, and occasionally emperors themselves. And once those togas came off, so did the pretense. Rank melted away with the sweat. In the bathhouse, a toga didn't protect your reputation, and a title didn't keep you from being talked about, or worse, talked to. Conversations floated like steam through the air. Did you hear about Octavia's affair with her flute teacher? Is it true that Marcus was caught embezzling temple funds? Even military news and political rumours often circulated here before they reached the forum. Some people went to the baths just to eavesdrop. Others went to subtly leak information. Think of it as ancient Rome's Twitter, but warmer and more humid. And the flirting? Oh, it was rampant. These places were co-ed in the early empire, at least in some regions and time periods, though eventually gender segregation became more common. But even with divided hours, the bathhouse was one of the few places where you could admire more than just someone's rhetoric. All that bare skin, all that olive oil, all those low whispers. It's not hard to imagine why the tepidarium was sometimes steamier in spirit than in temperature. Some bathhouses even had their own reputations. Certain locations were known for being more, let's say, socially adventurous. If you were a respectable senator, you might choose your venue carefully. Too much time in the wrong therme, and you might find yourself the subject of the very gossip you came to hear. And yes, even emperors knew this. Some used bathhouses to gauge public opinion, or mingle with the people, safely oiled and stripped of officialdom. Others avoided them entirely, fearing assassination between scrub-downs. Let's not kid ourselves. Roman baths were sexy. You're naked, everyone else is naked. The air is filled with perfume and steam, and the lighting is just dim enough to excuse a lingering stare. For many Romans, bathhouses weren't just about hygiene or gossip. They were the empire's most casually seductive spaces. Yes, the official story is that baths were for public health and civil virtue, but unofficially, they were flirtation playgrounds. Men and women, at least early on in the empire, could bathe at the same time, or share overlapping hours. Naturally, this led to more than a few accidental towel drops and oops wrong pool moments. Wealthy Roman men treated the baths as opportunities for romantic or illicit encounters. A wink in the tepidarium might lead to a shared oil massage in the corner. And don't think women were passive observers. Wealthy matrons were known for their fashion, their wit, and their own agendas. The bath was a stage for showing off, gossiping, and occasionally picking out their next poetic admirer. In some places, bathhouse workers, especially slaves who offered massages or poured oils, became part of the unspoken undercurrent of desire. There were laws passed at various points to limit promiscuity in the baths, which tells you everything you need to know about how well people obeyed them. Of course, not everyone approved. Conservative senators and moralists ranted endlessly about the corruption of public bathing, especially mixed bathing. Some emperors banned it. Others reinstated it, probably after remembering how fun it was. The moral pendulum swung with every regime change. One decade's steamy indulgence was the next's public disgrace. Still, most Romans just accepted this flirtatious atmosphere as part of the package. You went for the heat, the scrub, the company, and if the gods smiled on you, a suggestive glance across the steam. And if you didn't want to be noticed? Too bad. You were naked in a room full of gossiping, oil-slicked citizens. Good luck blending in. While Roman baths were undeniably social hotspots, they also doubled as ancient wellness centres, the kind where your doctor wore a toga and your treatment involved sitting in a steamy room until you hallucinated wellness. Yes, Romans bathed for their health, or at least for what they believed was health, which sometimes included snake oil, literally. To start, the Romans had a strong grasp of hydrotherapy, even if they didn't call it that. Alternating between hot and cold rooms, like the caldarium and frigidarium, was thought to boost circulation, purge toxins, and balance the body's mysterious inner forces. No one had discovered germs yet, but they were pretty convinced that steam plus discipline equaled immortality. Doctors even prescribed bathing routines. Got a fever? Try the tepidarium. Gout acting up again? Soak in the caldarium, then rinse with cold water and hope the gods approve. Digestive troubles? Maybe a steam, a massage, and a light oiling would fix your bowels. It didn't always work, but it definitely made you feel like something was happening. Some baths, especially those near natural hot springs, had reputations as healing sites. The waters at Baiae, for example, were famous across the empire. People flocked there not just to relax, but to recover from battle wounds, arthritis, heartbreak, or political exile. If nothing else, the warm water and wine probably made everything seem a little better. And let's not forget the Roman version of a spa treatment. Massages with exotic oils, scrubbing with perfumed powders, and even bloodletting on site, if you were into that kind of thing. A bit of lavender oil on your temples, a rub down with olive oil, maybe a leech on your foot for good measure. Voila, ancient luxury. Of course, a lot of it was pseudoscience, especially by modern standards. Balancing the four humours, for example, was more guesswork than medicine. But considering the alternatives, like biting on a stick while your barber doctor bled you out, the baths were probably your best bet for staying healthy and sane. In the end, Roman baths were a kind of holistic therapy. Part doctor's office, part spa, part social club. You left feeling better not just because your pores were clean, but because your mind had been steamed, your ego stroked, and your enemies quietly judged in the sauna. If you think all the real power plays in Rome happened in the Senate, think again. Some of the empire's juiciest decisions and shadiest deals went down not under marble domes, but in sweaty, half-naked bathhouses, with steam fogging up the corners and senators whispering over cups of diluted wine. Baths were where lines blurred, status, power, and even protocol. Once you stripped off your toga, you stripped off your titles too. A governor could be sitting next to a baker, a general lounging beside a retired gladiator-turned-philosopher. And in that setting, everyone talked freely, which in Roman society meant everyone gossiped, bargained, and manoeuvred. Political alliances? Some of them were born right there in the tepidarium. A quiet word in a corridor, a knowing glance during an oil massage, a promise murmured over the splash of the frigidarium. It was all part of Rome's informal machinery of influence. You didn't need an official audience with a senator if you could catch him halfway through his grooming ritual. And emperors weren't above it either. Some, like Hadrian, were known to mingle in the baths with citizens, not out of humility, but as a power move, a way to appear accessible, wise, and ever watchful. Others sent spies disguised as common bathers to eavesdrop. If someone spoke ill of the emperor in the Caldarium, there was always a chance the guy next to him was on payroll, and suddenly your next bath was in a dungeon. Patronage networks also thrived in the steam. A wealthy patron might offer legal help, a job, or even a villa recommendation, all during the hour-long scrub fest. Meanwhile, lower-class clients would flatter, praise, and make themselves useful. Bathhouses became the LinkedIn of the Roman world, just with less clothing and more olive oil. And like any political space, the bathhouses weren't always peaceful. Arguments flared, deals went sour. Sometimes even murders happened, though not often. It was considered very bad form to stab someone in a communal spa. Very rude. Ultimately, Roman bathhouses were far more than social clubs. They were informal arenas of influence, where reputations rose, fell, and occasionally got soaked and wrung out like a sponge. Politics didn't stop at the door. It simply got slippery. While the elites enjoyed marble columns and gilded mosaics, the ordinary Roman citizen, the baker, the soldier, the fishmonger who always smelled vaguely of anchovies, also had access to the baths. In fact, public bathing was one of the few luxuries that Rome extended across class lines. But let's not pretend it was equal. A plebeian's bath experience was very much a no-frills, bring-your-own-strigil affair. Most neighbourhoods had smaller, more modest bathhouses called balnei. These weren't as flashy as the massive imperial thermae, but they got the job done. Hot water, steam, cold plunge, maybe a slave to help with the oil. If you were lucky, you had access to a communal latrine nearby and a vendor selling stale bread or watered-down wine outside. Entrance fees were cheap, usually just a few quadrans, pocket change, and sometimes waived entirely on festival days. For the working class, this made the bathhouse not just a place to get clean, but a critical part of daily life. You'd swing by after work, rinse off the sweat and grime, and maybe spend an hour chatting with neighbours about the latest gladiator scandal or tax increase. Of course, things could get crowded. The popular hours saw bathhouses packed wall-to-wall with half-naked, sweaty people all shouting over each other. Hygiene was subjective. If the water wasn't changed recently, you might leave dirtier than when you came in, but with the warm glow of civic participation. Women too had access, though often with segregated hours or separate facilities. Roman moralists grumbled about mixed bathing, but working-class women didn't always have the luxury of strict propriety. Some bathed with children, some brought laundry, some just came to escape the endless demands of domestic labour and enjoy a moment of heat and peace. Even for slaves and the poorest free citizens, the baths were a brief equalizer. For half an hour, they could sit in the steam next to a centurion or a shopkeeper and share the same gossip, the same heat, the same communal sweat. Because in Rome, cleanliness wasn't next to godliness. It was next to relatability. Whether you lived in a tenement or a villa, the baths reminded everyone that even emperors had body odour, and that, for one steamy hour, we all soaked in the same empire. At their peak, Roman baths were the heartbeat of daily life, cleaning, connecting, and conspiring. But as the empire began to crumble, so too did the hot stones and humming pipes of the bathhouses. What was once a symbol of Roman civilization slowly turned into a ruin, with weeds growing where steam once rose. The decline began subtly. As the Western Roman Empire faced economic trouble, maintenance of public facilities, like roads, aqueducts, and yes, baths, became increasingly difficult. Bathhouses relied heavily on the aqueduct system, which required skilled workers, constant upkeep, and a government that wasn't falling apart. As these systems faltered, so did the steady flow of hot and cold water that kept Rome so relaxed and smugly clean. Then came the Christian emperors. To them, Roman baths were suspiciously pagan, a little too nude, a little too decadent, and a little too full of flirtation. The steamy mingling of bodies didn't align well with rising Christian ideals of modesty and restraint. Over time, mixed bathing was banned, then public nudity discouraged, and eventually, many bathhouses were shut down altogether or converted into churches, monasteries, or rubble. By the time Rome fell in the 5th century, many of its grandest thermae were abandoned. The once spectacular baths of Caracalla became home to stray goats and crumbling frescoes. And medieval Europe, having lost both the engineering knowledge and the cultural appetite for communal hygiene, entered what many call the Age of Dirt. Bathing became suspect. Cleanliness was seen as vain. Soap, a luxury. Hot water, optional. But the Roman baths didn't vanish completely. In the East, the Byzantine Empire preserved some of the tradition. And in the Islamic world, Roman bath architecture evolved into the hammam, where ritual cleansing and social life continued in steamy chambers reminiscent of the caldarium. Today, ruins of Roman baths still stand, silent but imposing, ghosts of steam-filled rooms that once echoed with laughter, debate, and maybe a scandal or two. They remind us that hygiene can be communal, that politics can happen in a towel, and that civilization isn't just built with laws and armies, but also with warm water, smooth marble, and the simple human need to connect. The steam may have faded, but the legacy never really cooled. In medieval France, food wasn't just nourishment. It was theatre, diplomacy, and bragging rights all served on a plate. Especially for the nobility, a feast was a full-on power display, where your wealth was measured not in gold coins, but in the size of your pastry swans and how many spices you could afford to casually waste. Imagine walking into a great hall lit by flickering torches, walls draped in tapestries, and the smell of roast venison mingling with cloves, nutmeg, and maybe a whiff of peacock. Yes, actual peacock. Feathers reattached after roasting. The message: I can kill something beautiful and serve it flamboyantly. What have you done today, Sir Gerard? Guests sat by rank, high-status nobles up front, lesser ones in the back, and if you were a peasant, well, congratulations, you were probably outside catching the pigs. The meal began with lavish processions, trumpets, heralds, possibly a man juggling meat pies. It was absurd, theatrical, and completely intentional. This wasn't a dinner, it was a medieval flex. The table itself was a performance space. Servers, trained to move with courtly precision, brought course after course. And by course, we mean layers of culinary excess. Roasted boar stuffed with birds, stuffed with sausages. Fish dyed with crushed berries. Meatballs shaped like hedgehogs. Food that defied logic, biology, and often digestion. And then came the subtleties, not subtle at all. These were elaborate sugar sculptures, jellies shaped like castles, pies that exploded with live birds, or, worse, musicians. They didn't just serve food, they served shock value. It was social warfare via sugar and swan. But here's the twist. While the nobility dined on gilded goose and wine-soaked everything, their trenchers, the slabs of stale bread used as plates, soaked up the grease and sauce. At the end of the feast, these greasy bread plates were handed to the poor. Generosity, sure. But mostly, it meant the nobles didn't have to clean up. Still, if you were a starving peasant, second-hand gravy-soaked bread beat nothing. If you cracked open a medieval French cookbook, assuming you could read Latin and afford parchment, you'd find an ingredient list that reads like a merchant's dream and a modern dietitian's nightmare. This wasn't peasant gruel territory. This was aristocratic cuisine, where the rarer the ingredient, the richer the chef appeared. Let's start with the spices. Medieval French dishes were spiced within an inch of their lives. Cloves, cinnamon, mace, nutmeg, saffron, ginger, and pepper were dumped into everything. Why? Because spices were rare, expensive, and imported from far-flung places like India, the Middle East, and North Africa. Sprinkling them with abandon was like burning money just to prove you could. And no, it wasn't to cover the taste of spoiled meat. That myth has been thoroughly debunked. Medieval nobles could afford fresh meat, and they had more salt than common sense. The spices were for display and symbolic power. A dish glowing with saffron wasn't just food, it was a yellow-hued status symbol. Now let's talk meat. Ordinary folks might get pork or chicken once in a while, but nobles dined on roast swan, peacock, venison, porpoise, and crane. Fish was also mandatory on fast days, so chefs got creative. Ever tried faux roast made from almond milk and crushed pike? No? Good. And then there were the sweeteners. Sugar was still exotic in most parts of France, so honey reigned supreme. Everything that could be sweetened was sweetened. Sauces, pies, meats, even soups. There's something deeply medieval about serving rabbit stew with a drizzle of rosewater and honey glaze. Fruits and vegetables? Rarely the stars of the show. They were cooked into oblivion or mashed into pastes. Raw vegetables were considered suspicious, cold, damp, and possibly the gateway to melancholy. Why eat an apple raw when you could boil it, spice it, stuff it with breadcrumbs and dye it purple? And speaking of colour, medieval chefs loved food that didn't look like food. Red sauces from sandalwood, golden pies from saffron, blackened meats from charred crusts. It was a kitchen masquerade, and the weirder it looked, the better. So yes, medieval French ingredients were bold, bright, and utterly bizarre. Not because they had to be, but because in the great social banquet of life, taste ranked far below drama. If subtlety was a virtue, medieval French cooks were sinners of the highest order. In the noble kitchens of 13th and 14th century France, the idea of seasoning to taste meant drowning every bite in a carnival of spice and sugar. You didn't want balance. You wanted your tongue confused and your guests impressed. Let's talk spices first. Clove, cinnamon, ginger, galangal, long pepper, cubebs, grains of paradise. Some of them you've never heard of, and that's fine. The medieval palate had no interest in restraint. A single dish might contain a dozen different spices, layered not just for flavour, but for symbolism, heat, and the sheer thrill of flexing your spice cabinet like a warlord's trophy room. And saffron? That was the gold standard, literally. Just a pinch of this hand-harvested stigma from the crocus flower could dye a dish a brilliant, unnatural yellow. Add saffron to your pottage, and everyone knew two things. One, you had money, and two, your cook had patience. But spices weren't the only sensory assault. Sugar, rare, imported, expensive, was used with wild abandon, even in meat dishes. That's right, sugar in your chicken stew, your beef pies, your fish sauces. Sweet and savoury weren't opposites in medieval France. They were dance partners in a very bizarre waltz. Entire feasts were constructed around this concept of culinary contradiction. You'd start with a heavily peppered rabbit dish, followed by sugared fish, then perhaps a rose-scented poultry stew, finished with a jellied dessert shaped like a castle. If your palate wasn't shocked, your host had failed. And it wasn't just about taste, it was about humoral theory. That's right, the medieval belief that your body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much heat? Eat something cold and damp, like sugar. Too melancholic? Have a spicy custard, that'll cheer you up. So while today's chefs chase umami and balance, medieval French cooks were chasing philosophy, social status, and spectacle. Their food wasn't trying to make sense. It was trying to make a point. I can afford to turn my goose into candy and still have change left over for a gilded hedgehog cake. In short, spice and sugar weren't seasoning. They were medieval megaphones, loud, strange, and impossible to ignore. When it came to protein, medieval French nobles didn't just eat animals, they paraded them. The menu was a hierarchy of prestige, and if your dinner didn't feature at least one weird bird or aquatic mammal, you weren't really trying. Let's begin with the obvious. Beef and pork were common enough among the wealthy, but they were too ordinary. The real status meats were things like venison, caught on elaborate noble hunts. Eating venison wasn't just a meal, it was a declaration. I have land, servants, and the free time to chase this thing on horseback. And then there were the birds. Swan, crane, heron, peacock. If it had wings and looked remotely elegant, the French tried to roast it. In the case of peacock, the feathers were removed before cooking, and then re-sewn onto the cooked body for presentation. Imagine trying to enjoy your dinner while it stares back at you in full plumage. Medieval cooks loved stuffing birds inside other birds, turducken but unhinged. A quail inside a pheasant inside a goose, perhaps. And all of it glazed in spice, honey, and occasionally dyed to look even more exotic. The goal wasn't just to feed, it was to dazzle, confuse, and slightly terrify your guests. But fish days? Now those were a creative challenge. The church declared roughly half the calendar as meatless, which meant cooks had to impress using only aquatic creatures. Enter eels, pike, lamprey, dolphin, and even porpoise. Yes, porpoise was on the menu, at least for the highest nobles. It was considered a fish in the eyes of medieval theologians, and thus totally fair game on a Friday. To make it fancy, chefs would mould fish into odd shapes, stuff them with spiced breadcrumbs, or serve them with sugar and cinnamon sauces, because clearly your trout wasn't weird enough already. And then there were fast-day meat lookalikes, fish shaped and dyed to resemble roast pork or chicken, sometimes even complete with fake bones made from hardened dough. The message? I'm pious, but I'm also rich and clever enough to bend the rules in style. So whether it swam, flew, or was chased through the forest, medieval French protein came dressed in spectacle, spice, and a healthy dose of religious loophole. Dinner was not just food, it was theatre, theology, and a feathered performance. Amid all the saffron-dyed swans and sugar-dusted porpoises, it's easy to forget that most people in medieval France weren't attending royal banquets. The vast majority were peasants, and their cuisine looked different. Less gilded pastry, more brown bread and boiled cabbage. But even here, food was deeply cultural, just without the trumpets. Let's start with bread, the true staple. It came in multiple classes, just like the people eating it. The wealthy ate fine white bread, called pain de froment, made from carefully sifted wheat flour. Peasants got the darker stuff, maslin, a coarser mix of rye, barley, and whatever else was on hand. And it wasn't just food. Bread was so central to daily life it was often referred to as simply the staff of life, or, in peasant terms, the only thing between you and starvation. Next, cheese. France was already a land of cheesemakers, even if Brie hadn't yet reached peak snobbery. Peasant cheeses were simple, made from sheep's or goat's milk, and often aged in cellars or eaten fresh and crumbly. It wasn't for display, it was for calories, protein, and a bit of joy in a diet mostly made of porridge. Speaking of porridge, pottage was the universal answer to the medieval French hunger problem. Boiled grains, vegetables, and maybe a bone or two if luck struck. The rich might call it a stew and serve it in pewter. The poor called it dinner, every single day. Now here's the twist. Even peasants used spices and herbs, albeit more modest ones. Garlic, parsley, mustard seed, sage, whatever they could grow or forage. The idea that medieval food was universally bland is false. It was practical, seasonal, and flavoured with whatever grew near your hut. Of course, meat was rare. Maybe a chicken for Easter, or a bit of salted pork in winter. More often, peasants got protein from beans, lentils, and whatever cheese hadn't yet turned blue from age or surprise mould. So while nobles were debating whether to dye their roast crane pink or purple, the rest of France was dipping crusty bread into hot cabbage broth and calling it a victory. It wasn't glamorous, but it was sustainable. And honestly, in a world without forks, maybe simpler was smarter. After all, you can't drop your swan flambé if you never had one. If you thought medieval French pastries were sweet little tarts filled with fruit, think again. These were not the dainty eclairs of Parisian cafes. In the Middle Ages, pastry was power, and the French used it to craft feasts of illusion, excess, and edible trickery. Let's start with the basics. A medieval pie wasn't always meant to be eaten. The crust, called a coffin, yes, really, was often made from flour, water, and lard and baked rock hard, not for flavour but as a medieval Tupperware. Its job was to hold the filling, not taste good. Think of it as the bowl you accidentally bit into. But what sat inside those pastry coffins? Sometimes sweet things, yes, apples, pears, figs, nuts with honey, but more often they were filled with meat. Venison, beef, pork, fish, sometimes all at once. Picture a pie that bleeds gravy when cut open, revealing layers of roasted duck and eel beneath a golden crust. Then imagine someone has dyed it green for flair. And then there were the illusion pies. These were the Instagram stunts of the 14th century. Some were filled with live birds. Yes, just like the nursery rhyme. Cut it open and out flew a confused starling. Others held musicians, costumed actors, or symbolic objects baked into the centre. One banquet featured a pie that, when opened, revealed a cooked lamb posed like a knight jousting with a roasted piglet. You had to wonder whether to eat it or knight it. Colour was critical. Pastries were tinted with saffron, spinach, beet juice or charcoal, turning them gold, green, red or ominously black. And then there were decorative sugar confections, castles, animals, saints, all carved in marzipan and displayed like trophies before being promptly devoured or stolen. The line between food and spectacle blurred completely during royal feasts. A pastry might arrive shaped like a ship, complete with sails. Another might be a gilded porcupine, bristling with almond quills. And yes, they occasionally exploded on purpose, a theatrical centrepiece that went off like culinary fireworks. In medieval France, pastries weren't dessert. They were decoys, drama, and decadence, wrapped in dough and baked for applause. Taste mattered, but not nearly as much as timing, presentation, and how many mouths dropped open when your pie turned out to be a magic trick. Pull up a wooden stool and prepare to get greasy, because medieval French dining etiquette was less about forks and napkins and more about fingers, hierarchy, and theatrical restraint. Sure, the food was over the top, but how you ate it could make or break your reputation at court. First rule, don't eat too fast. Gorging like a hungry boar was frowned upon, especially if you were within sight of nobility. Meals were about controlled indulgence. You could stuff your face with peacock, but you had to do it with graceful boredom, like it barely impressed you. Second rule, no forks. Not yet. Most nobles ate with 3 tools, a knife, a spoon, and their fingers. The knife was for cutting meat. The spoon was for soups or soft stuff. And the fingers? They did everything else, but not all fingers, just the first 3. The pinky and ring finger were to stay clean, a symbol that you were civilized enough not to become fully sauce-coated. That's where the finger bowls came in. Between courses, servants brought basins of rose water to rinse your sticky digits, sometimes scented, sometimes warm, because nothing says refinement like smelling of poultry and lavender at the same time. Table manners were rigid and deeply performative. You tore bread, never bit it. You never reached across someone's plate, even if they had the better pigeon. If you sneezed, you turned your head and offered a quiet apology to your fellow trencherman. Speaking of bread, remember those trenchers? They weren't just plates. They were silent indicators of status. The higher your rank, the finer your trencher. When the meal ended, yours might be handed to the poor, or tossed to the dogs. Either way, you didn't ask. You dabbed your lips with the back of your hand and pretended you didn't just eat a pie shaped like a dragon. Drinking had its own rules too. Wine was everywhere, but you never drank before the host, and you always toasted with solemnity, even if you were half in your cups. Getting drunk was acceptable, as long as you weren't the only one. So yes, medieval French cuisine was outrageous, but the etiquette was designed to tame the chaos. Behind every absurd dish was a rigid script, and every greasy finger was carefully wiped in a ritual that said, "I may eat like a king, but I behave like a courtier." In medieval France, food wasn't just about pleasure or power, it was deeply tied to religion, which meant everyone was constantly navigating the spiritual minefield of when to eat, what to eat, and how guilty to feel about it. The church calendar was packed with rules. Roughly half the year was designated for some form of fasting or abstinence. That didn't mean no food, it meant no meat, dairy, or eggs on designated days, especially Fridays, Lent, Advent, and numerous saint days sprinkled across the year like holy landmines. But medieval French cooks weren't deterred. They were creative theologians with ladles. No meat? Fine. We'll serve eel, sturgeon, whale, or even porpoise. According to church logic, anything that swam counted as fish, even if it was technically a mammal with a blowhole. So yes, porpoise stew was a Lenten dish, served with a drizzle of almond milk and maybe a saffron-dyed crust for good measure. Eggs and cheese were also banned during strict fasts, so the solution was fake food. Almond milk replaced dairy in everything from soups to sauces. Butter was swapped for oil, and cheese was made from ground nuts or legumes. There were even mock roasts, where fish was moulded, dyed, and carved to resemble forbidden meat. Culinary deception became a form of religious compliance, loopholed piety with a side of parsley. But when fasting was over, it was time for a feast of biblical proportions. Religious holidays, weddings, coronations, and saint feast days triggered enormous meals, sometimes lasting for days. Monasteries and noble courts alike would host lavish banquets to honour the occasion, and make up for all the culinary self-denial with roast everything, sweetened everything, and drunk monks napping under tables. Even monasteries, places of austerity, often had excellent kitchens, fine wine cellars, and access to elaborate recipes. One monk's modest pottage was another's subtly spiced trout with stewed apples. God, after all, wasn't against flavour, just vanity and gluttony, which explains why so many medieval chefs got really good at making food that looked humble but tasted like sin. In medieval France, religion didn't cancel cuisine, it inspired it. Every restriction sparked innovation, every rule encouraged a workaround, and every fast eventually led to a glorious rule-bending feast. Because in the end, nothing sharpened a cook's creativity quite like holy limitations. Though the sugar-glazed porpoise and meat-stuffed peacock have long disappeared from the dinner table, the spirit of medieval French cuisine still echoes through modern culinary tradition, just with fewer feathers and significantly more restraint. Many of the elaborate techniques pioneered in medieval kitchens, sauces thickened with breadcrumbs, meats marinated in wine and vinegar, and the layering of sweet and savoury, laid the groundwork for classic French cooking. The flamboyant excess may have faded, but the obsession with presentation, texture, and complex flavours never really left the kitchen. Dishes like coq au vin or bœuf bourguignon, while rustic and hearty, reflect that same foundational idea. Meat should be tender, marinated, seasoned boldly, and slowly coaxed into something transcendent. The medieval passion for layering flavours, sweet, acidic, spicy, is still found in wine reductions, mustard-glazed meats, and fruit meat pairings. Even French patisserie owes a nod to medieval sugarcraft. The marzipan animals and architectural sugar sculptures of the 14th century evolved into modern pastry art, croquembouches, and those absurdly intricate chocolate showpieces you see on cooking competitions. The desire to shock and impress with dessert hasn't gone anywhere. It's just traded meat pies for mousse towers, and the French reverence for dining etiquette, courses, and ceremony. Pure medieval DNA. The idea of structured multi-course meals with carefully paired wines and formal seating started in noble great halls and was refined over centuries into the Michelin-starred rituals of today. Even the spice rack tells a story. While saffron and long pepper are no longer the main stars, herbs and spice blends, once symbols of elite access, are now staples in French provincial cooking, democratized and refined over time. But perhaps the greatest legacy is cultural. In medieval France, food wasn't just fuel, it was status, identity, and performance. And that idea, that food reflects who we are and what we value, still defines French cuisine today. Whether it's a rural picnic with goat cheese and wine, or a Parisian tasting menu with 15 courses and a spoon that costs more than your shoes, the meal is a message. So no, you won't find gilded hedgehog pies on the menu anymore. But the medieval kitchen lives on, in every French chef's precision, every flamboyant sugar sculpture, and every meal that's meant to be remembered long after the last bite.